Welcome to Empowering Humility, where we're on a mission to promote human flourishing by restoring humility as a common denominator in society today. Let's dive in.
Hello, and welcome back to the third episode of the Empowering Humility podcast. Again, today we have Giancarlo Newsome, CEO of Humility. Thank you for joining us, as always. But we also have a special guest today, Bryan Hedrick. Bryan, can you introduce yourself for our listeners? Who are you? Why are you here?
Thank you so much, Brandon and Giancarlo, for the invitation to come and be able to speak today. A little bit about me. I'm a active duty Army chaplain, but I'm also a bit of an academic. I have a PhD in leadership studies and been doing some work with Humility and Giancarlo in the consulting world to kind of look at how does humility impact leadership? How does humility impact the human being? How does the humility impact our overall happiness and our overall ability to thrive within this world? And so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. I love that you mentioned happiness because that is, in fact, what we're going to be talking about today. So the title of today's show is The Happiness Without Humility Delusion. And this came about from a conversation that you guys had, and I was just happened to be on this thread watching it take place, but it came from a newsletter that was published by an organization called clearerthinking.org. And they had a newsletter that was titled, What You Might Be Getting Wrong About Happiness. And they had three main points, if I could summarize them this way. First, happiness isn't just about momentary pleasure, but it involves life satisfaction. Not just a moment, but the whole entirety or sum of the experiences that we have in our lives. The second point was money can buy happiness, but its effect diminishes at higher income levels. That's really interesting. And a lot of people have talked about this for a long time, but it is kind of a fascinating little factoid. And then the third point is happiness is partially within our control, though constrained by external factors like trauma or bereavement and things like that. And so you guys went back and forth about, what is happiness and how is it related to humility? How do you define that? How do you think through that? And so there's a bunch of different points that you all were making over a period of several days and weeks. And there's a lot of different ways to think about happiness too. And so I want to start with how to define or think about happiness for the purposes of this conversation, because you can look at it from a frame of psychology, maybe biology or neurobiology, what's going on in our minds. You can look at it from a theological or faith-based spiritual perspective. And so there's a lot of different definitions or ways to think about it. And so, Bryan, I'll start with you. First question here. What is happiness? And I know that's such a huge question, but how do you think about it? How do you define it? What influences your thinking on that topic?
Thanks for asking. That is go ahead, Giancarlo.
I was going to jump in that, maybe in some other fun context for our listeners it is the new year. And most New Year's resolutions are kind of framed around Happy New Year, by the way, guys.
Yeah. Happy New Year, January 2nd. Here we are recording day.
That's right. So I think, that context too for what is happiness is some awesome framing going to the new year. So thanks, Bryan, also, by the way, for joining us. Really appreciate your insight.
No, thanks so much, Giancarlo. So when I think of happiness, I'm going to share from my tradition and my background a little bit. So I will bring a little bit of theology, like you mentioned, Brandon, into it. I, by denomination, am Christian, Baptist, and so I'll speak kind of that framework a little bit, but I want to expand beyond that because I know a lot of our listeners are not necessarily within that framework, and that's okay, because happiness is something greater than just a theological framework. And in many frameworks, it can be kept in a negative light. At its base level, happiness is a feeling. It's a feeling of joy, of excitement, of being beyond just contentedness. You mentioned the biological frame. It's that endorphin rush that we get when we are simply happy about something that's occurred. The challenge with the word happiness is that a lot of times it can be taken out of context. You mentioned the psychological framework for a moment, because in psychology, happiness, satisfaction, and contentment, according to most of the research that's out there right now, have been lumped into the same boat. They've been lumped into the same categories. And so when we say happiness, satisfaction, contentment, in psychological studies or in many of our social science research, it means the same thing. And that's problematic because they're not the same thing. In fact, there's research now coming out in the last 2-3 years. They're trying to break apart those constructs because happiness as a feeling is different than satisfaction and contentment. And I think we find this from our theological framework. In my background as a Christian pastor, happiness is that feeling, whereas contentment or joy is a state of being, which is a very different construct. It's, I would say that happiness plus humility plus contentment is what we equate to happiness. Whereas happiness is not in and of its own thing a norm, if you would. I'd also say that one of the challenges is, how do we pursue happiness?
Right.
Do we pursue happiness or do we pursue content? And what is the difference there? I know we'll dive into this a little bit more later, but kind of just as a quick teaser, pursuing happiness, you mentioned there that money can buy happiness, but it diminishes. I'm going to push back against that for a second.
Interesting.
Money can buy content. It can buy the ability to not need anything at the moment. But in true contentment, what true happiness is not about wanting, it's about not wanting. And that's a big difference. And so I look forward to kind of unpacking that more, but at its base level, happiness is just a feeling. It's the joy that we experience when, from a biological perspective, endorphins are moving through the body. From a philosophical or theological perspective, when we are at a place of joy, where the circumstances are where we are excited and happy about what's happening. And from a psychological perspective, when we're at ease and we're reduced stress. I'll kick it back over to you if that answers your question, or Giancarlo, if you want to add.
Yeah, Giancarlo, what do you think? How do you think about happiness? And we'll get to, talking about humility and maybe contentment in a minute, but just generally speaking, how do you approach it? What do you think about that word?
Well, and I think, my context is also so heavily concerned with the influence of, let's say, AI and technology in fueling, let's say, false happiness. So I like if it's emotional, it's temporal, it's almost like the feeling of a drug high, a drug hit. You could argue that when you're high, you're having temporary happiness. So in that period of time, hey, you feel just like money. But long term, what if you're self-destructive? And that's what, I think that's what kind of queued up my concern in this conversation when I read the article. Is like, okay, I mean, we're talking scientifically about, and I've seen the stats, I think, the money you need to be happy levels out at about, I think it was $65,000. Like the more you make, like your relative happiness level does improve slightly, but it completely levels out. But even then, I mean, you could, and this was one of my questions to Bryan, is, narcissistic happiness. And, how we could be undermining ourselves and not realizing it, which is kind of a creepy, and that's kind of the essence of pride, right? Is, you're so consumed in your world that you don't recognize it and you've become your own slave. So it's really, especially in today's paradigm. So that's kind of my, where my headspace is, but I'm not the expert. One of the things I also wanted to highlight with Bryan, I really love, and part of the reason why I'm so happy he's helping our team, is even in theology, we can frame a different framework of happiness that can also be narcissistic, regardless of your tradition of faith. And what I really appreciate with Bryan, not that he intentionally did this, but the military, they intentionally work to be pluralist. And it's been a real struggle for me to say, okay, how can we represent our own unique framework of faith, but be true to our I think collectively, most faith have, most of them have have a desire to be truthful at its most root source. So I don't know. I'll let Brian or Brandon, you can kind of pick up all those pieces.
Well, if I can, real quick, I'd like to jump
Yeah.
in and just highlight one thing that you mentioned, Giancarlo. You talked about happiness and narcissism. And I think that's where a good distinction needs to be made here for a moment, is because a lot of times we can either go to one extreme or the other. Happiness is either something that we are pursuing with all of our being because we don't want to be unhappy. And that can become narcissistic. Absolutely. We're pursuing the feeling at the expense of other things. And this is kind of where contentment comes into the picture. Contentment means being the idea where I am okay with my circumstances now, and I don't need to seek or desire at an unhealthy level. Now, we're at the beginning of the new year. We're talking about goals and growth across LinkedIn and everywhere else. That's what's the main theme right now. And there's nothing wrong with goals. There's nothing wrong with ambition. The challenge becomes when we measure our success or failure based on a feeling, such as happiness. And that's where it can become narcissistic in that way. However, happiness in and of itself is not narcissistic. It's not wrong to be happy. In fact, when we look from a theological perspective, for example, God created us for his pleasure. There was happiness in our creation as human beings, in our development being made in the image of God himself. In fact, when we look at just through the Psalms and through the rest of Scripture, we see that God desires us to be happy. But there is this idea of contentment that goes with it.
And also to make others happy. And also to make
absolutely.
Others happy. Yeah.
Absolutely. We are agents of happiness, both being able to seek happiness ourselves, but also to seek the happiness of others. And I think that's where the line with the narcissism comes into play. When we seek happiness of ourselves at the expense of others, or at the expense of all of those other things in our lives that we have to have. You mentioned, for example, addictions and how we can chase this false sense of happiness. I would almost push back slightly to say that there is some happiness found there. The problem is that when you seek after that addiction, the happiness that you're seeking is at the expense of other things that are just as critical and important in your life. So while you may find happiness, what makes it temporal, it makes it fleeting, is that the damage that's caused by what you seek does not allow for long-term happiness, satisfaction, contentment in your life. That's why we seek after that next rush, that next high, that next whatever. And this is not just about addiction. It's also about individuals that seek adrenaline rushes, for example, or going out and, I worked in the special operations community for a long time and watching individuals that were driving way too fast on the road or their motorcycles or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with those things, but they were chasing this adrenaline high that they had reached when they were in combat, and they couldn't replicate it in the civilian world here in the United States. So they went into risky behaviors to try and recapture that, because that feeling of happiness that they experienced, they coveted and put others at risk as a result. So that's where narcissism comes into this equation. The feeling of happiness is not bad or good intrinsically. It's how do we pursue it? How do we become agents of it for ourselves and for others? That is how we then categorize, is this healthy or not?
I would imagine some of the soldiers that you've seen, like what you just described, it's they have that adrenaline rush, or they have that momentary, excitement, happiness. It did bring them some of that kind of satisfaction and purpose, maybe in their work, whether it was combat or whatever it might be. And because of that, their brains took on this shape, the neurons that fire together, wire together kind of idea, where your brain becomes that kind of thrill-seeking excitement kind of entity, and trying to replicate that, but it's fleeting. It doesn't. It's the thing that you're seeking. So I love that, and it makes me think too of this concept called Christian hedonism. If you've heard of that, so John Piper, famous pastor, theologian, years ago, I think it was in the 90s or early 2000s, when he wrote this book called Desiring God. And he flipped the first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which is, what is the chief end of man? And the Westminster version says to to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And he says, the chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying him forever, which is to say, if you pursue God and you pursue your own pleasure in God's pleasure, you will find that kind of happiness or that long-term kind of joy and contentment, some of that things that we're talking about. And what I find interesting about that in this discussion is it's bridging some of that psychology, some of that theology, but also talking about humility and narcissism, because some people have criticized him as saying, well, you're creating a hedonistic, pleasure-seeking, like selfish kind of person, that they're seeking their pleasure by enjoying God. And he's saying, yes, that's exactly right. Because if I'm bringing flowers to my wife, I'm seeking my joy by bringing her joy. That's the argument that he's making. And I think it's kind of this interesting concept that kind of bridges all these things into one topic. Now, it's very controversial. People have criticized him for decades about it. But I'm curious what you guys think about that as a way of kind of getting through the kind of tying these threads together.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it perfectly. It's the idea of purpose and meaning that is a derivative that brings about happiness. I mean, or one of the key factors in what makes happiness. That's one of the reasons, like Giancarlo mentioned with this false happiness, is that there's very rarely a meaning or purpose behind it. So it doesn't have something to anchor it. When I bring my wife flowers as well, similar to what you mentioned, there's a pleasure to me, there's happiness to me, but it's in a meaning and purpose. It's rooted in that sense of being a husband that my wife deserves, who I've been called to be, who her happiness and her being able to see that smile on her is a deeper meaning and purpose. Talking about the soldiers that I've served, they don't take pleasure in war. What they do is they take pleasure in the purpose that they've served in. What they've done has meaning. It has this sense of connectedness, not just with the world, but with the people that they were there with a cause that they believed in. And in that, even though there was hardship, even though there is great trauma, great difficulty, they were able to, many of them, walk away with then this sense of purpose and belonging that really translates then into happiness. And that's really, like I mentioned before, where we look after contentment. Contentment allows room for negative aspects. It allows room for suffering. It allows room for pain. It allows room for things to not be perfect. A lot of times, one of the misconceptions about happiness is that happiness must always be right. It must always be good. It must always be that picture perfect moment, if you would. For example, I've got 4 kids. We're really excited about Christmas this year because every year we do what we call the Hedrick Family Games. It's this opportunity to do like minute to win it like games. And we're not competitive at all. No, they're incredibly competitive. And we had this new game and my wife was like, let's try this. Now, remember, 3 of my kids are on the spectrum, so it's a little bit more fun and challenging. But we played this game where they had a present wrapped up in a bunch of layers of wrapping paper and had to then rip through all the different ones wearing oven mitts. They lost their minds. Like, I had my 9-year-old screaming, throwing the present across the room because he was mad. My oldest one was laughing at him, making it even worse. And in the back of mine and my wife's head, we're like, wow, we've just ruined Christmas. We have traumatized them for life. Now, also in the back of our heads, in our more humanity, we were like, oh, we're doing this definitely next year again. But that's beside the point. But the thing was, at least going in my mind was, okay, things are not perfect right now, therefore we're not happy. And it took me a moment to step back and be like, you know what? Happiness does not have to have everything perfect all the time. It does have a central theme of meaning and purpose. It has a central theme of connectedness, has a central theme of aligning my beliefs and my values with that higher purpose. And in that, even when things are negative, even when things are bad, at the moment, I can still be happy through it. And that's what I think has been lost in our society. And that's where I believe humility comes into play, because humility allows that self-reflection to realize that I do not need to always have the ephemeral high that we associate with happiness, that I can be content in the moment and truly be happy regardless of my circumstances. Giancarlo, I'd love to hear what you have to add on.
Man, lots of awesome stuff there. And I think on our last podcast, I share another pastor friend. He mentioned something similar, like when we understand that security is an illusion, kind of like you said, like everything has to be perfect to be happy. It echoes with the same thing. I also was going to pay forward a really cool, you're talking about meaning and purpose, and like we're talking flowers to our wife. So my wife overheard me. This was about 4 months ago. I don't know how, but I guess I was debating between buying flowers or paying for a lady to come clean the house. So just a free tip to all the guys out there with ladies. Like, if you have the choice, cleaning the house she says, hey, I really prefer that. Like, there was almost deeper, longer term meaning and purpose, but to your point. So just a free tip. And something else I wanted to ask, for you to maybe peel the onion some on it. I being a guy in the military also, you do see these guys that just have incredible meaning and purpose, but also we know how, the suicide rate I remember you shared with me that there's not a suicide problem with soldiers who are in the service, active service, practicing. It becomes a problem only when they leave. Or not only, but I think maybe you can clarify or unpack that a little bit and maybe tie it together.
Yeah, well, let me clarify the comment first off. So that was mainly within special operations. Now, the regular Army is seeing issues with suicide, but I think that the underlying causes are the same. We used to talk about, when I was within special operations, I've served in multiple different units, about 7 or 8 years of my career thus far. We're in that community, and they focused on, yes, they had a suicide problem in SOF, special operations. My experience was that was not the case. The case was we had suicide issues within veterans of special operations, those who had left, or those who were no longer functioning in their primary role. So in special operations, the team is the central focus. That's what you aspire to be. You aspire to be on that team, whether it be an operational detachment alpha in the Green Berets, a civil affairs team, a MISO team for our psychological operations folks. Being on that team is what matters. And when you cannot be on that team anymore, that created this dissonance, this identity crisis, where if I'm not a Green Beret, if I'm not an operator, who am I? And it goes back to that sense of meaning and purpose. When you lose the sense of meaning and purpose in your life, it's very easy to see that then life becomes meaningless. I often talk suicide prevention in each of my in-briefs that I do with the soldiers and civilians that I work with currently at the research lab that I work at here in the Army. And I always use the illustration of, is a chair an object or is it a person? And this is, if those of you listening out there, if you think a chair is a person, contact me. We'll do some counseling and get that straight. A chair is definitely an object. The chair you see that I'm sitting in right now, it is an object. This is not a trick question. But because it's an object, I can treat it certain ways. I can stand on it to change a light because it can be a vehicle for me to do what I need to do. I don't care how the chair feels. It's just an object that I can stand on. If it's in my way, I can push it because, quite frankly, I don't care how the chair feels. I'm not thinking about, is it feeling like it's in its place, its purpose, its meaning, being there in front of the door? No, it's a chair. Move out of the way so I can do what I need to do. Or until we've talked about it, quite frankly, it's irrelevant. Most of us have not listened to this podcast this far, thought about our chairs and be like, hey, you're a sentient being. Do you care that I'm sitting in you right now? Because it's irrelevant until we need it. Problematically, we can treat others the same way. One, we can treat people like vehicles, obstacles, or irrelevant. Or two, we can start to treat ourselves that same way. And when you think about how we treat ourselves that way, if I've been told I'm an object for so long, if I've been treated like an obstacle, if I've been treated as irrelevant, or if I've been treated as a vehicle, it's easy, the longer I'm told that, to start to believe it's true. Now, how does this relate to suicide? And then how does this relate to humility? First off, for suicide, I can't kill myself if I believe I'm a person. I have to see myself as an object, first and foremost. We talk about the suicide problem across the Army. It's that we have individuals who are part of an incredible team who feel that they are nothing more than an object in their lives. And that's completely untrue. They are people of value and worth. Does not matter who they are, what rank they are, what job they have. They are people of value and worth. They are not a chair. But the more that we see ourselves as a chair, the more we can think that way. This is the tie to humility. Humility, one of the key aspects of it is self-awareness. Seeing myself for who I am, not less than and not greater than. The way I like to say it is, true humility is seeing myself the way that God made me, with my imperfections, with my strengths and abilities, with all of the value that comes along with being a person created in the image of God. That is what humility is in terms of self-awareness. It's seeing myself accurately. Part of that means then I'm not a chair. I have to see myself as a person of value and worth. That's not arrogance. That's not narcissism. Narcissism and arrogance says, I am the greatest human, or I am the only, or I am the most important. That's not what we're talking about here. Humility states, I am of value and worth because I'm a human being. And that has a huge impact when we talk about things like suicide, domestic violence, sexual assault, all these other negative aspects or these negative behavioral patterns that we are combating within the military, combating within the civilian sector, combating just as human beings across the world, because all of them have the same root. And that's this idea that we have objectified other people instead of seeing them with the value that they have. The second aspect of humility is this idea of not just self-awareness, but awareness of others. It's a crucial form that Dr. Brad Owens and others have discussed in terms of their research on what humility looks at. And it's so important because a lot of times we think humility, that's just me. Humility is also seeing the value and worth in each one of you. Seeing and knowing that, Brandon, you are an incredible developing podcast. I am terrible. That is a humble statement.
You're doing
not
great,
in the
Brian.
sense of, well, I mean, it truly is. You can do the video editing and all that. I could probably figure it out about a year from now if I really, really try hard. And even then, I still probably don't have the talent or skills that you do. And that's not self-deprecation. That's a recognition of the gifts and skills that God has given you. Same thing with you, Giancarlo. You've got so many skills and abilities in both leading e-humility as well as then your role within the military, your role within your family, that I quite frankly look back and I'm like, wow, that's that awareness of others that is so important, because you're not objects, you're people. You have value, you have worth, you have strengths, you have weaknesses too. And that's where humility comes into helping to be honestly able to save lives, able to transform lives in a very positive way.
I love that connection to objectification because I have some connections to elite athletes and they feel very much the same way when they're on a professional sports team or on a very high level, like collegiate team. They feel like they're just kind of like an asset, a cow kind of going through this machine. And as soon as they're not useful anymore, they're cut, or, it's very transactional relationship. And that kind of thing can be very, very damaging to somebody, because as soon as they're cut or they're injury, they get a career-ending injury, they're just like, what am I? What am I doing? I have no purpose. I have no service. And so I love that idea of kind of awareness of yourself, of others, but also, if I could add to that, like an awareness of your situation in the world or in the universe, even, of just like, there is more to life than sports or the military or my job or my role. There's more to that. And I think like the connection I'm making, the way that you're talking is like, is along the lines of contentment and satisfaction. Because I think that's where there is like purpose, there's meaning, there's joy, there's suffering as well. And you can be joyful through suffering. There's the moments of emotional happiness and things like that. And so I've come to think of happiness as sort of like this overall sense of my life is worth it. I'm satisfied. I'm content. Not that I don't want things, I'd love to drive a new Tesla or, a fancier computer or whatever. It's not that, but it's this idea of like, the whole picture that I'm painting on my art as my life, I am satisfied with it. A little more blue here, sure. A little more yellow here, sure. But overall I'm satisfied. And I think that traces through the centuries from the Greeks and their idea of eudaimonia, the idea of like flourishing, into the Hebrew and Old Testament scriptures, this idea of shalom. And then you have the New Testament and on of blessedness, happy are you, happy is the person who is doing such and such. And I think it's Aquinas that talks a lot about virtues and kind of bridging all the 7 core virtues from Aristotle, and then the 3 core virtues from faith, hope, and love from theological lines. And I think putting all of those together, you do build this like life that is satisfied, and you don't have this like deep need, because that need, like you said, that wanting is what is contributing to a lack of happiness. So I think there's something in there about that, but I think it does take humility to get there. I think that's the key.
I think you're absolutely right. And I agree with you. I've worked with a couple of elite athletes as well. Then, like I said, with elite warriors, one of the challenges is always, we're nothing but a number. I mean, SOCOM used to talk about the human weapon system. And that's something that myself and several other chaplains really pushed hard against, because it objectified them from the very beginning. It said, basically, you are a weapon system, and if you don't function right, then you need to leave and go off and do something else.
Interesting.
Now, a lot of my research here lately is really centered on this idea of sense of self, and how do we remove this role identity, or how do we get beyond the role identities that we have? Because each one of us have various roles. I'm a warrior, I'm a father, I'm a priest or pastor, you can name all the different roles that we have. The problem is that we have this thing called this identity issues, where we take on that identity to where it overshadows everything else, where that becomes our only identity, and that's what we then make into our core. Now, as I've done my research in this area of core identity or sense of self, humility, you're absolutely right, is a core component of that. Being able to see myself accurately through those roles, being able to see that who I am as a person may be changed, or maybe nuanced, I think it's a better word, nuanced by my roles, but it doesn't change fundamentally by those roles. When we anchor ourselves in a role, we are setting ourselves up for failure. I mean, I talk with soldiers all the time. I ask them, okay, when did you join the Army? And I say, okay, 40 years from now, you're taking off that uniform one way or the other. Me, myself, I've been in for 22, going on 23 years right now. I know that even if I'm allowed to serve my entire time, which I'm not probably, and if my wife is listening to this, don't worry, we're not sticking around another 17 years. But let's say that were to happen. Minimum, I will be out of the Army by March 1st, 2042. Wow. That's the maximum time allowed to serve. I'll only be 57 years old at that point in time. So I know that I have an expiration date on my role as an Army chaplain, but I don't have an expiration date on my core identity as Bryan Hedrick. Those roles give nuance. Now I can push, and I can desire, and I can absolutely, like you mentioned, I can strive for greater things. I can continue to push in a positive way, and that's healthy. That's great. So long as it doesn't become an unhealthy obsession rather than a healthy ambition. And I think humility is what grounds us in that. When you look at that core sense of self, I really see this idea of spirituality, our sense of meaning and purpose, our sense of connectedness, our sense of core values, and it aligns with humility, and they are interconnected, where we have this sense of ourselves, we have this awareness of others, and we have this openness to learn, that in tandem together, it creates a strong core that can withstand those changes in our lives. It's when we don't have that strong core that when the role does shift, we now have issues like you mentioned with the athletes that feel, okay, well, I'm nothing more than a performer. And when I can't perform, I'm now nothing. It's interesting, if you look at the literature after the Olympics, for example, mental health crisis in athletes skyrockets after the Olympic Games. We see suicides go through the roof of Olympic athletes, even individuals who won gold, even individuals who medaled.
Wow.
We see it increase because they had worked into their pinnacle. And now the question is, well, what am I
Yeah.
if I'm not that? Or what else do I have? And it's that core identity that grounds them with that humility and seeing themselves accurately that is what is able to hold us through it. That's why humility is so crucial to be developed, to be worked on. Because if we ignore it, when those crises of identity occur, we don't have that muscle that we're used to using to be able to help us through those challenges. Giancarlo, were you going to say something?
No, I keep having a flashback. I had I think, the military and large institutions, the success in a role, like the higher you go, the more your rigidity to fill it as designed defines your happiness or not. And it's almost to be humble to say, okay, what my ability to listen to others is going to go down because that's going to put a threat to that role. Well, I basically had a personal situation where, so, I came out of the innovation world, and that whole environment is like the extreme of openness to learn. Like it's live or die if you can't learn, but it's a threat to institutional environments where you have and I was basically told, leave your innovation stuff behind. Here's your manual for your role and just do that. And it was really awkward for me, back to you. And I thought, Brandon, you brought up a great point, is that humility. It really kind of bothered me, but even this conversation made me go, okay, happiness is a broader view. It's like, okay, I'm going to respect where he's at, that very institutional role. He's protecting that. I'm in effect kind of threatening that, but there's a place for that protection though, right? When the Army wants you to be a lethal weapon system, and that part of that is to protect you, right? And there's just like, I like what you said, like these nuances of maybe that's what humility gives us, is nuances, so that nothing becomes our identity improperly, maybe, as kind of some summary conclusions I'm drawing from both you guys.
If I could share a quick story, probably one of the best leaders that I saw within my time in SOF that epitomized this idea of humility and happiness together. We were at a workshop for the human performance and wellness part of the organization. So focused on human performance, psychological, spiritual, physical. We had gotten together, all of our practitioners across the Special Operations Command, United States Army Special Operations Command. And this Green Beret, 06 Colonel, walks into the room. He's been a commander of a group. He's been commanding at all levels. He walks into this room of scientists, of human performance coordinators and professionals, chaplains, etc. And he walks in, we already know that what our goal is, what our job is to help them figure out this program. And we were expecting it to be very one-sided. Here's what I want, here's what I need, go do it. He walks into the room. This has been in for almost 30 years now at this point, seen just about everything. We put on his dress uniform, more medals than can count. He walks in and he says, listen, I am the dumbest person in the room on human performance. You are the experts. I need your help to tell me what we're missing to make this truly work. And it kicked off a 2-day exercise of collaboration and thinking that was unlike anything I had experienced in the Army at that point. And now he was not dumb. He was not, he had worked at West Point Athletics. He had worked in so many different other jobs. He was not dumb, but he realized that that the people in the room had the expertise that he needed, and that his job was not to be the expert. His job was to bring the experts together to create this product that would then empower our soldiers to thrive and win on a battlefield. But knowing that role, knowing his purpose, knowing his sense of meaning, knowing and being aware of others in the room, he did not need to show anybody else up because that wasn't his role. He didn't have to be the smartest guy. He was content in being the one who would then bring everybody else and let their brilliance shine forth.
I
And we had
just
some
got to
incredibly
make
brilliant people there.
I got to make a plug. It's just too obvious. He was empowering humility, right?
He was.
I love
Absolutely,
that.
he
That's
was.
the name of the
Without
podcast.
question.
That's
Yes.
right. That's right.
Yes. But for somebody of that, not only rank, position, experience, etc., to be able to say, I know my limitations. I know my strengths. I know the strengths of those around me, and I'm open to learn. That is the very definition of leadership, or humility and leadership. That is the very definition of happiness and contentment within his position, because it was not a 2-day exercise of seeing some commanders that lose their mind and just are hating life. We had fun as a group.
Yeah.
We had a great time, and you could walk around, you could see it in his demeanor that he thrived and enjoyed not being the spotlight. He didn't need to be at that moment. And that's where humility and contentment, like I mentioned before, humility plus contentment is what I believe equals happiness. When we have the awareness, when we have then the contentment that goes along with it, where I can just be satisfied in my status quo, now I can be happy. If I'm missing one of those two, if I'm missing humility, if I'm missing contentment, happiness is an illusion. It's something that we grasp at. It's something that we strive for, but very, very rarely find without humility and contentment to be at the base of it.
Awesome.
Amen. And another plug, if you want more resources like that, Bryan, thank you so much. I would encourage folks to go to empoweringhumility.com, because that is where a lot of these kind of resources, there's an app, there's all kinds of, podcast episodes and blogs and things like that to help learn how to be more of a humble, content, self-aware person, to be more like the leader that Bryan had mentioned, because it is that when you see somebody like that, when you come into contact with somebody like that, it changes your life, because you see, like, that's what I want. That's somebody who has like a well-lived life. They're happy, they're content, they're humble, and they empower other people to be the kind of leaders that they can be. And it's really an amazing thing.
Brandon, I think we should plan on a follow-up on flow state, because several times you were summarizing, Bryan, I'm sure you got some thoughts on flow state. And, I've seen I forgot the name of the book. I wish I could remember it. But he talks about it, but the context in which he presents flow state, it's kind of, again, back to that narcissistic happiness. Like, I want to achieve this peak emotional experience at a top athlete, top elite warrior, but my true connection, I don't even say the word compassion, just true connection and understanding that my strength is the product of the strengths of everyone around me. And another kind of follow-up thought too that we might play into is, I know, like, I participated in this new type of AI called conversational swarm intelligence. And it's kind of using technology to in effect, enable more collective empowering humility. But those are some follow-on thoughts, Brandon, we might, and Bryan, we might just expand upon. But really awesome stuff, Bryan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bryan, for your expertise in this area. I know you've done years and years of studying and reading and researching about this topic, and so I'm so grateful that you're able to share your wisdom with us and with our listeners. And so would love to have you back on.
No, thank you both so much. I really enjoyed it.
All right, guys. Well, we'll see you next time on the Empowering Humility podcast. Thanks for joining. See you then. This episode is brought to you by Snap Market, a hyper-efficient marketing subscription. No contracts, no hiring, no firing, just great work. Find out more and subscribe today at snapmarket.co.